meditation on the Larger Catechism. We look today at questions numbers 146 and 147, which read as follows. Which is the 10th commandment? The 10th commandment is, Thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's house, thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's wife, nor his manservant, nor his maidservant, nor his ox, nor his ass, or anything that is thy neighbor's. What are the duties required in the 10th commandment? The duties required in the 10th commandment are such a full contentment with our own condition, and such a charitable frame of the whole soul toward our neighbor, as that all our inward motions and affections touching him tend unto and further all that good which is his. The 10th commandment, of course, brings to a conclusion our meditation on the 10 commandments, and what a commandment to conclude with. In some respects, we could have looked at the 10 commandments as compelling outward behavior, ordering us to observe certain outward standards by which we would be regulated and governed. But here, the final commandment reminds us that God's law not only has to do with outward conduct, mere outward observance, but also has to do with our inward life, our feelings, our thoughts, our emotions, our desires. All of these things come under the purview of the law of God. In some respects, that sets the law of God apart from civil law, and that civil law really doesn't manage your thoughts or inward life. It's merely concerned with outward behaviors. Some religions also reflect that kind of civil approach and simply manage outward behaviors and don't especially address the inner attitudes of the heart. The 10 commandments focus on the heart. The heart is where the issues of life flow. And so we come to the conclusion, and we are finding the law of God focus on us most directly. The Apostle Paul, as he himself, being a Pharisee and well acquainted with the law, reflected on the law and tried to observe the standards of the law, realized that A, he could not keep them perfectly, but more specifically, it was this commandment in particular that produced within him great conviction for his sin. He knew that deep down within his heart there was this tumultuous set of feelings, emotions, thoughts, and ideas that went contrary to God's holy will. So this commandment convicted Paul of his sin and brought him to his knees. It has that effect on all who listen to what it has to say. Jesus reinforced this in his Sermon on the Mount. When he reviewed the law of God, of course, he said that he did not come to abolish the law, but to fulfill it, or to show its full extent, and to enable us to keep it. But in showing us the full extent of the law, he identified the fact that, for example, keeping the law, thou shalt not commit murder, does not simply mean don't clock somebody across the head. You don't have the inward desire to do so either. And so the inner attitude was under consideration. When the law of God searches our hearts in these ways and examines us, who among us can say we are innocent, we are above fault? Who can say that I am living a moral and upright life, that I am perfect before God and acceptable before Him? There's some in evangelical circles today, in holiness movements and that sort of thing, who believe in perfectionism, that we can obtain a position of being perfect before God. Not so. I think if you think about what goes on within your heart, you see that you fall far short of God's holiness, His righteousness, His perfection. And so, positively, the Catechism addresses our attention to this commandment as to how we should obey it. And one of the first things that the commandment stresses is contentment. Contentment with our condition. God in His sovereignty has placed you in the position where you are at. in your particular home, your particular community, your particular family setting, and all the rest of it. God has placed you in this position. And it might be very easy to look at your neighbor or somebody down the street or somebody across the aisle or something to that effect who's doing much better than you. And maybe you become anxious, envious, or upset. The commandment here reminds us that we should have contentment. Be very content with what God has given to us. It is God's loving and gracious provision for us. The Apostle Paul advised Timothy that godliness with contentment is great gain. And that is true. If we can live life being thankful for the good things that God does provide us, that will surely transform our lives from bitterness and anger and feeling deprived to joy and celebration, thanksgiving for that which God has blessed us with. Think on your blessings, as the old song went, count them one by one. See what God has done. If you think on what God has blessed you with and give thanks for that, your whole attitude towards life will change dramatically. We should have a charitable frame of mind towards our neighbor. Everything within us should tend towards the benefit of those who are around us. And so that would be the positive way in which we ought to observe this law. Surely Jesus himself fulfills this law for us. He loved us, and that is what brought him into this world. He loved us, and so he gave up his life for us. He did not regard the things that he had in heavenly glory as something that he had to keep hold of. But he emptied himself, as Paul says, and became poor. He took on our human nature, took on our humanity, took on our sin for us, even bearing the wrath of God for us. Why? Because that in his heart, he loved us. He loved you. And he gave himself for you, for your redemption, so that you would enjoy eternal fellowship with God. Jesus shows us how to keep this commandment, and he's kept it for us, and we rest in his provision.